Aleister Crowley is one of the most controversial figures in occult history. He called himself the Great Beast. The British press called him the most wicked man in the world. Most people who have heard of him picture the theatrics, the robes, the rituals, the reputation. But that's not what this video is about. This is a video about what Crowley claimed to experience. What he wrote down in his words about the things that came to him. Yeah, so seriously, like, subscribe, thumbs up. We're talking about spooky ghosts today. Okay, so who was Aleister Crowley? A lot of people know him, and there are hundreds of videos documenting his life. That's not really what I'm here to do, but I do need to give you some context. Almost every modern magical tradition, Wicca, chaos magic, Levian, Satanism, they all have traces of Crowley's fingerprints. All of it owes something to what he built. He tried to turn occultism into a rigid system. A science, almost. Something that could be reproduced and documented. And unlike most people who claim to have experienced something supernatural, Crowley had the paperwork to back it up. And I'm talking mountains of paperwork. He didn't just leave behind a handful of stories and a mysterious death. He left behind diaries, ritual records, annotated manuscripts. Truthfully, he was an obsessive. Whether that meant talking to spirits or talking to himself, he documented everything, which means we actually have something to work with. He was born in England in 1865 into a wealthy and deeply religious family. His father was a preacher, and his mother was a very strict devout. She was the first to coin his nickname, the Beast, as in from Revelation, the Antichrist. And while she meant it as a rebuke, Crowley wore it proudly. He went on to Cambridge, and he studied chess and mountaineering and poetry, and whatever else wealthy eccentrics got up to in the 1890s. But somewhere in there, he got seriously interested in the occult. In 1898, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the premier magical society in London, a secret organization doing serious ceremonial magic, Kabbalah, astrology, tarot, the whole apparatus. Crowley thrived there. He rose through the ranks faster than almost anyone, and that's part of the reason things went sideways. By the end of the 20th century, the Golden Dawn was tearing itself apart. There was a mess of infighting over internal politics, and Crowley found himself in the middle. So, thrown out, disillusioned, Crowley is looking for something the Golden Dawn hadn't yet been able to give him. That's how we get to Cairo in 1904. This is where our story really starts. Crowley is 28 years old. He's honeymooning in Egypt, and he's looking for answers. Rose Kelly was not an occultist. She had no background in magic. She really didn't even care about Crowley's experiments. And she had no training in anything esoteric. She was just his wife on their honeymoon. But from the moment they arrived in Cairo, she started going into these states. She would become dazed and start muttering, always coming back to Crowley and repeating the same thing. "They are waiting for you." Crowley was skeptical. His experience with the Golden Dawn had left him wary of anything supernatural. So he started testing her. Well, actually quizzing her on Egyptian mythology and symbolism. He wanted to see if she actually knew anything, or if she was just making it up. Of course, she failed every test. She kept confusing gods and misidentifying basic symbols. Then, he decided to take her to a museum. He tasked her with finding an image of the god Horus, and he silently sneered to himself as she walked past several obvious images of him. But then she pointed to a glass case in the distance, too far away to make out its contents. And she shouted, "There! There he is!" She led him upstairs and across the room, and pointed out a 7th century BC funeral stele, a small stone tablet barely larger than a piece of paper. Crowley noted that this artifact was housed under the inventory number 666. This artifact was to become known as the Steel of Revealing. Crowley would later commission replicas of it to be made, and his followers would place it upon their altars to be used in the Gnostic Mass. On April 7th, his wife gave him a set of instructions. For 3 days, at exactly noon, he was to go into their apartment's drawing room, which he had set up as a temple space, and he was to sit down at his desk and write down whatever he heard. So, on April 8th, he goes in. The voice of Aiwaz came from over my left shoulder, in the furthest corner of the room. The voice is described as passionate and hurried, and was of deep timbre, musical and expressive. Its tones solemn, voluptuous, tender, fierce, or aught else as suited the moods of the message. Not bass, perhaps a rich tenor or baritone. Further, the voice was devoid of native or foreign accent. He also described what he saw, or felt he saw, alongside the voice. A figure, something tall, dark, somewhere in his 30s. It was incorporeal, seemingly made of incense smoke or something similar. He was well built, with the face of, in Crowley's words, a savage king. The clothing suggested a time period of ancient Persia or Assyria, but only vaguely. And he had these eyes, these veiled eyes. Veiled, he said, lest their gaze destroyed what they saw. Like whatever was hiding behind that thin veil was too much for physical reality to handle. I think that's really interesting. One of the things that drew me to making this video was the description that Crowley gave to these entities. They're all very different, and they all have this sort of, I don't know if I would call it malice, this otherworldliness, this, they all have this kind of restraint to them. Like they're all holding something back. For 3 days, he sat in that room from noon to 1 o'clock, writing down what the voice said. The result from these sessions was Liber all vel legis, the Book of the Law. But Crowley hated it. He wrote later in his confessions, "The fact of the matter was that I resented the Book of the Law with my whole soul. For one thing, it knocked my Buddhism completely on the head. I was bitterly opposed to the principles of the book on almost every point of morality. The 3rd chapter seemed to me gratuitously atrocious." He tried to publish it and move on, but he lost the manuscript. 2 years later, he would find it again, and he would read it again. And over 40 years, he slowly became convinced of an unsettling truth, that perhaps he hadn't written it as he believed he had. We are forced to conclude that the author of the Book of the Law is an intelligence both alien and superior to myself, yet acquainted with my inmost secrets. And most important point of all, that this intelligence is discarnate. Over the rest of his life, he would identify Aiwaz at different times as different entities. As his holy guardian angel, as Lucifer, as a god from ancient Sumer, and as something completely different, as something beyond all of those categories. But he never landed on an answer, so he just kept coming back to that question. And whatever Aiwaz was, it came back. In 1907, Crowley wrote that the voice came back, and it dictated 2 more texts. And then it prompted him to create his own magical order. By the end of his life, Aiwaz was still a presence he described in his writing. Something less like a memory, and more like a continuous presence. 5 years later, Crowley is 34. The Cairo encounter has changed him, focused him, given him a mission. In November of 1909, he and his disciple Victor Newberg, one of Crowley's most devoted students, traveled into the Algerian desert. At some point on that trip, Crowley would hear a familiar voice. Aiwaz was there, telling Crowley, "Call me." He would instruct Crowley to use the 30 Aethers of Enochian magic, an old angelic system that was developed 3 centuries earlier by John Dee and Edward Kelly. They traveled through that desert for weeks, working through Aether after Aether, all the way down. In the Kabbalistic system Crowley worked in, the Tree of Life has 10 spheres, connected by paths. The highest 3 spheres, the ones closest to the divine, are separated from everything below by a gap called the Abyss. In that abyss lives one thing. The name of the dweller in the abyss is Choronzon, but he's not really an individual. The abyss is empty of being. It is filled with all possible forms, each equally inane, each therefore evil in the only true sense of the word. That is meaningless. So Choronzon isn't exactly a demon, at least not in the conventional sense. He's more of a personification of incoherence. There's no structure to him. Really, it's the opposite. He's the opposite of structure, the opposite of meaning, of self. He takes every possible form at once, which is the same thing of taking no form at all. To cross the abyss, to reach the higher 3 spheres, you had to pass through it. And Crowley thought passing through it meant facing it directly. Eventually, after weeks of passing through the Aethers, they finally found the place where they would perform the encounter. We walked into the desert until we found a valley of fine sand. There we built a circle of stones within it. Newberg took his place with a dagger and notebook. Outside the circle, I marked the triangle of art. At each of its corners, the blood of 3 pigeons was poured. Then I entered the triangle myself, to invoke Choronzon. He was going to let Choronzon speak through him. Newberg's one job was to not let anything, and this was specified explicitly, to not let anything, even wearing Crowley's face, break into the circle. Newberg wrote the account of what followed as he heard it. Something began to speak, using Crowley's voice, but not his manner. First, it shouted blasphemies, too fast for Newberg to write, and then Choronzon started shifting shape. First, he took the form of a woman, specifically a woman that Newberg had known, a prostitute from Paris. The figure was trying to seduce him out of the circle, but Newberg held strong. Choronzon then turned into an old man, and then a snake, and even Crowley himself begging for water. But still, Newberg held strong, and then Choronzon finally declared himself. "My name is Desperation, and I cannot be overcome in argument." And then it started to do something that no other form had been able to. While Newberg was focused on the shifting shapes, Choronzon began to erase the protective edges of the circle. Quietly, patiently, it started shifting the sand with its hands, grain by grain, under the cover of darkness. And then it broke through. Choronzon sprang from the triangle into the circle and wrestled Newberg to the ground. The scribe found himself struggling with a demon in the shape of a naked savage, a strong man who tried to tear out his throat with froth-covered fangs. Newberg, invoking the magical names of God, struck out with his dagger and finally forced the writhing figure back into the triangle. The ritual lasted for a little over 2 hours, and when it ended, they burned the circle into the sand. Crowley wrote afterward that throughout the evocation, he had been astrally identified with Choronzon. He had felt from the inside each anguish, each rage, each despair, each insane outburst. He described crossing the abyss and declaring himself master of the temple. Associates said that the ritual permanently damaged him and that Choronzon never fully left. I think that it's worth noting that the original pages from this encounter, the words that Newberg wrote down in real time as he heard them, were ripped out of his notebook. Nobody knows who tore them out, or where they are, or why they did it. There's also a postscript to this one. Years later, Newberg gave an entirely different account of the event to a journalist. He said that what they'd actually summoned was the spirit of a foreman builder from of the Chaldees, who called himself P472, that it had been a comedy from start to finish. A farce. Nothing worth discussing. That could be the truth. Or it could be a cover-up. Or it could be the result of staring into the abyss. Maybe the trauma of the event made him rewrite his memory into a safer, a friendlier encounter. I don't know. By 1918, a lot has happened. Crowley has set up his own magical order named the AA. British tabloids have started to declare him the most wicked man in the world. But much like his reaction to his mother's nickname, he finds it to be more gratifying than upsetting. He's in New York now, living in Greenwich Village, and he's addicted to heroin. And I'm not saying that as some sort of gotcha. I just think that it's important context for where he is mentally. He's conducting these rituals with this woman named Roddy Minor that he calls the Amalantra working. And these sessions are strange, even by Crowley standards. The working combined sex magic and drug rituals. Minor would slip into trance states and then report on whatever she saw, and Crowley would ask questions. But the answers would come back fragmented. Numbers and symbols and half images that felt just on the verge of being recognizable, but ultimately never resolved into anything coherent. The very first session was held on January 14th, 1918. Minor described a vision. There was a most beautiful lion standing by the fire. The wizard was standing and still held 1 or 2 sticks in his hand. He smiled and said, "Child." I then saw a most beautiful naked boy, 5 or 6 years old, dancing and playing in the woods in front of us. The wizard was very happy and satisfied looking. He sat down and reached out his hand to me and had me sit down beside him. As we watched the boy, he put his left arm around me tenderly, and I placed my head on the left side of his chest, near the shoulder. He said, "It's all in the egg." That wizard would be named Amalantra, the namesake of these rituals. These sessions went on for months and months, from January to June. A king who came out of a fountain holding legal papers and a map of South America, a dwarf, and pages upon pages of numerology. It all seemed to be flowing with symbolism, but being kept just out of reach. Crowley kept asking the wizard for the message. "What's this for? What does this mean?" And he kept getting put off. He was being shown small visions instead of answers. So, at one point, after feeling led on, Crowley just asked the wizard directly, "Do you have anything to say to us?" And the wizard's answer, in full, was, "No." Now, Crowley thought that this was significant. It wasn't quite a refusal, but rather a statement. On February 3rd, something shifts. In the middle of the fleeting symbolism, Minor describes a flaming lamp. And inside of it, something specific. On shelf where egg is, a flaming lamp appears. Over the lamp is a peculiar light. In this light, there is a peculiar large-headed, particularly large-eyed small bird. Also, there is some strange kind of material, like drapery and folds. At the time, it felt like another piece of symbolism, another fragment left to the wind. At some point after this, though, the exact moment isn't recorded, Crowley said that he made contact with something else. Something he called Lam. Lam is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path. In Buddhistic phraseology, he assigned it a numerical value of 71. In his system, that number meant no thing, a gateway to the void. But that's about all he wrote about it directly. But he did draw a portrait. He said he drew it from life. The following year, at an exposition in Greenwich Village, he unveiled it. The head is large, smooth, and hairless, tapering to a pointed chin. The mouth is slit-like. The eyes extend part ways around the sides of the face. There's no suggestion of clothing beyond what appears to be a cloak buttoned at the neck. Nor does the entity have any ears. I'm sure that a lot of you have probably made the connection. Honestly, it's hard not to see it. In 1972, an occultist named Kenneth Grant, a student of Crowley's, mentioned the portrait in one of his books. And this brought a lot of attention to it. People started taking a good look at it. In short, Lamb resembles nothing so much as a typical UFO occupant of the examiner type. What Americans would call grays. Yep, that's right. I'm back on my bullshit. Talking about aliens, baby. The modern gray alien archetype, the one that's in every UFO documentary, that wasn't really popular until the 1960s. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction in 1961 was one of the first widely reported cases to describe the wraparound eyes, the oversized head, and the small mouth. And then there was Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, which has a famous cover. I'm sure you've seen it. It made the Greys iconic. That wasn't published until 1987. There's a lot around that. I'm not going to get into it. Maybe I will in another video. Who knows? I like aliens. I like talking about aliens. I'm sure I'll make a video on them. What you need to understand is that Crowley drew this image decades before it became a widespread phenomenon. And he really didn't say a whole lot about it, which I think is pretty strange. Crowley, again, is known for his extensive documentation. He kept diaries of every ritual, every encounter, every conversation. Lamb didn't get as much. He got a portrait, a name, and a number. Later occultists would take that silence and they would run with it. Kenneth Grant, through his Typhonian order and his extensive writings on what he called the Typhonian current, developed the idea that Lamb represented ongoing contact with non-human intelligences, or extraterrestrials. So he published protocols for making contact with Lamb. He called it the Lamb Statement, a step-by-step method for making contact with Lamb. Essentially, you're supposed to stare into the image until your consciousness merges with the entity inside of it. It's not something that Crowley wrote or sanctioned. It's all just based on Grant's own interpretation of what the portrait represented. There is an obvious objection to all of these encounters, and I want to be upfront about it. I want to acknowledge it. Crowley was on a ridiculous amount of drugs for most of his adult life. Hashish, cocaine, mescaline, peyote, and even heroin. That one he was addicted to until the day he died. And he would use them as sacraments. They were tools for accessing altered states. And he wrote extensively about them, especially on the psychology of hashish. Israel Regardier, Crowley's personal secretary, someone who had spent decades studying his work, he argued that Aiwass was probably a manifestation of Crowley's own subconscious. That Crowley was, in some sense, his own most gifted channeler. That's a reasonable position, right? And honestly, it's pretty logical. If you look at all of these encounters through that light, they take on a whole different meaning. A man so deep in his own psychology that he could create text that he couldn't even identify as his own. Encounters so vivid that he couldn't even identify them as a self-deception if he had tried. But there are some things that don't really fit into that explanation. The Cairo working happened in 1904, before the really serious drug use, before the heroin. And whatever Rose Kelly was doing in those weeks before the encounter, the trances, the specific answers, the museum incident with the steel, that wasn't Crowley. And then there's Choronzon, the pages torn from Newberg's notebook. Newberg's contradictory accounts decades later. The fact that multiple people close to Crowley said that the 1909 ritual broke something in him, permanently. That it changed him. And then there's the Lamb portrait, a creature with obvious ties to the gray alien archetype. but it predates it by decades. I don't know what any of this is, really. It could be a number of things, a few possibilities. It could all be real. These beings could have all shown themselves to Crowley. They could have given him messages and instructed him. Or it could be the ravings of an addict. What I do know is that he spent 60 years chasing it, documenting it meticulously, oftentimes to his own degradation. He kept getting hurt, and he kept going back. At the end of his life, Crowley was in a boarding house in Hastings. He was broke, and only 12 people attended his funeral. But he was still writing about Aiwass. He was still trying to describe what happened to him in that room in Cairo in 1904. I was bound to admit that Aiwass had shown a knowledge of the Kabbalah immeasurably superior to my own. He wasn't performing. No, he was being honest. He was being honest with himself about his own limitations, about the limits of his own understanding. He spent his life chasing that high. His first encounter. Okay, that was my Crowley video. If you liked it, I have more videos. I have a video about Odin. I have a video about Russian homunculi. A lot of great stuff, if I do say so myself. As always, I'm sure I missed stuff. So if you have any more context on Crowley, or on his encounters, or on larger esoteric points that I'm sure I'm not learned enough to know about, please leave it in the comments. Okay, yeah. Other than that, thank you for watching, as always. I do really appreciate it. Like and subscribe. Okay, bye.